Hello and welcome to this Greater MSP discussion video where we'll be exploring the advancement of racial equity. I'm Abdul Omari, your host. We have some great guests who are going to be with us today. First, we have Danielle Steer, the Managing Director of Lunar Startups, Duchesne Drew, President of Minnesota Public Radio, John Naylor, President and CEO of Medica, Adair Mosley, the President and CEO of Pillsbury United Communities, and Acooa Ellis, Senior Vice President of Community Impact at the Greater Twin Cities United Way. Appreciate y'all being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So I've been thinking a lot, as I'm sure all of you have, around the notion of what has changed in our region specific to racial equity, social justice, since George Floyd was murdered. And I'd be curious to know from your perspectives, what, if anything, has changed?
I think a lot has changed. I think social injustice has been around for generations, and I think this has brought it to the forefront, and we're having meaningful conversations and, more importantly, actions around it. So I think as a country, we're getting used to uncomfortable conversations now. I think we ignored it in the past, and we're acknowledging that it exists, and we're having those conversations.
I believe the private sector in this moment is the thing that I've seen change the most in terms of explicit conversations around race, using terminology like white supremacy inside of their institutions, bolder goals to be able to really bring more diversity and equity and inclusion to companies. So that's one of the biggest things I've seen.
One of the things that I have found most interesting is the conversations that I might have with a girlfriend in a trusted space are happening in the open. And it's been interesting how people have received it. It's not always comfortable. Duchesne and I were talking about a conversation that I helped lead yesterday, and even the extent to which I shared how I experienced the leadership in the time following George Floyd's murder, that wasn't comfortable. So everyone is uncomfortable, I think, to some extent. Some people are tired, even more tired of talking about race, because we've been talking about working on advancing racial equity for some time, and I find myself going back and forth between being energized and excited about the fact that more people are willing to talk about what's going on and fighting skepticism that it'll just be talk. Like, I want to believe that this time will actually be different. Like, you've got to believe it in order to be in this work and doing the work that I'm doing. But in the back of my mind, waiting for a shoe to drop, or waiting for the energy to die, or waiting for the will to move beyond the talk to actually do something different, to dissipate, and for folks to kind of get lulled back into comfort.
Yeah, that's my biggest fear, is that people will get tired of being uncomfortable. But I also think that that's framing many of the discussions that we're having and a lot of the planning that's going on. It isn't about, what can we do for the next year or two until the heat goes away. It's like, what can we do to transform our organizations, to transform ourselves personally? And that's a big piece of it, particularly for leaders in this community, to look in the mirror and think about what they could do to become more culturally fluent, and what they can do to become more effective leaders of organizations that are truly anti-racist and truly equitable, and recognizing that it's not simply going to be addressed by reading a book, right, or by spending a few dollars here or there. It's much more like the way I'm sure we all think about technology as being part of our budget. There's not a time when that goes away. It's part of how we do business. It's part of how we get from where we are to where we need to be. And I feel more so, and I've been in this market for more than 25 years, I feel more that the conversations we're having now, that's understood, that this has to become kind of a lifelong commitment to change and be better, and to do it in ways that affect our employees, and do it in ways that affect our customers, our clients, in our case, our audiences, and the region, in a way that we shouldn't be having the same conversation 25 years from now.
I think a key phrase I've been using since the murder of George Floyd is awareness to action. I think, to your point, it's a great point. We've had awareness in some context, but now we got to go to action. And the challenge for all of us is what can we do? And your comment about, as leaders, our sphere of influence is to start to create action plans for ourselves, for our sphere of influence, and then encourage them to take it to their sphere of influence, so that we have a movement of change. So I really think this awareness to action and make sure that it continues is really important.
One of the things that we saw in the entrepreneurial ecosystem that I'm hopeful everyone can double down on and we can see go even further is that this transition and kind of more awareness around how historically, when we think about entrepreneurs who identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, the organizations that support them and kind of the ethos around that work was charitable, was meant to be philanthropic, as opposed to really seeing diversity of experience and race and ethnicity and gender as revenue driving, asset building, wealth creating, possibilities for our community. And I think that we started to see a lot more data come forward. We started to see the aggregation of data from different sectors be used to say, like, this is good for the community. We need to be investing in BIPOC entrepreneurs. We need to be working with our local business owners and creating new jobs in a way that I think the conversation is just starting to change enough where we can move from charity to opportunity, from strictly philanthropy to more of wealth building and job creation and these other relevant economic factors that can elevate an entire community.
We all know that diversity will increase quality of product. But there's also a tension in that, right? Because that's very capitalistic, right? And so in some ways it's like, all right, well, we'll grow everybody, right? Meaning I'm the wealthy and I grow and then you grow a little bit, but the gap doesn't change, right? So what's the tension between the moral conversation around human beings, right? And human bodies, and then this kind of capitalistic productivity, we're gonna make some more money conversation?
Self-interest. So the self-interest of the wealthy is to remain wealthy. So I'm on the board of the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce, and we've talked about this on our own very aggressive equity journey. It's who cares if you have a business if a growing segment of the population is not positioned to take advantage of it?
The way I often talk about it is that if BIPOC people continue to struggle and fail in this community at the same rate, but become a much bigger part of the pie is not the same. I mean, the pie is who we are, right? And so if we go from, right now on the state level, we're approaching 20% BIPOC and approaching 30% here in the metro area. And, by the time my kids are my age, that number is going to be a lot bigger, right? And so if somewhere around half of the people in this metro area aren't getting the education and the health care and don't have the housing and all the other sort of basic platforms that allow you to live your life and be your best, this isn't the community that we like to think of ourselves as being, right? I mean, for those of us who don't worry about where the money's coming for our next check, which is probably a good number of people who'll be watching this conversation, right? Our numbers will shrink as a percentage of who we are as a people if we don't get this right. And I think a lot of folks hope that their children will, choose to make a life here and have a good life here. And whether they're Black, white, or green, if more than half of the people here are struggling in 2050, it's not going to be a healthy environment for anybody.
Yeah, if we don't drive more aggressively toward demonstrable change in terms of equity, we leave more and more potential on the table, more and more greatness on the table. I mean, that's the outcome. We squander it.
And most talented people choose to live elsewhere. That's
Absolutely.
the other thing, right?
Absolutely.
No one's foot is nailed to the floor. They're going to go where their best opportunities are. So even our own kids of color who grow up here will choose to make a life someplace else.
Yep.
And I think we have to recognize the way that the system is built is that there are individuals that are meant to be at the bottom based on class, right? That feeds this capitalistic structure that is deeply embedded with white supremacy and designed to benefit a certain person, right? And so what are the ways that we can dismantle some of that, right? I get in there's anti-capitalism and there's pro-capitalism conversations. I'm not going to do that in this one. But what I will say, though...
You want to do that over drinks?
Yeah. But what's heavily important is ways that we can start to democratize wealth amongst those on the ground, right? We're seeing models of co-op, co-ownership. We're seeing owners that are conscious enough that they know that they've gotten and ascended to wealth off the backs largely of Black and brown people, and now turning businesses over to them. And so more ways we can do that, more ways we can strip out white supremacy. And further, that system is designed to further social stratification, right, in a society. There are traditional indicators with that kind of system, like we measure it by wealth, money, all of those kind of more tangible quantitative measures that sometimes don't translate to what community believes are the things they value and measure, particularly Black and brown communities. I'll use the example of education. I will talk to a parent. We have over 20 charter schools in our portfolio. I will talk to a parent and say, wow, why do you choose that school? Even though maybe the academic standards are not as great, they will tell me that they value something different. They value the relationship, they value the sense of security, they value that connection, and this is a Black parent, over some of the other things that society has said are important to a family. And so the more ways we can eradicate that and dismantle it and align those systems based on what we believe is true, I think we'll see more parity, more equity overall.
Choosing nurturing and affirmation over test scores.
Right, exactly.
Ask, what are the, is there a common theme among those things that they identify that are counter to what like dominant culture would identify as?
Our counterparts are looking at that kind of academic data, looking at, certainly proficiency rates, acceptance rates into colleges, and all those things we know are important, right? But I would have to say, I question myself often saying, is it important because I've adopted a white supremacist mindset? As a Black leader, I'm oftentimes asking myself, am I perpetuating systems of white supremacy? And I have to also know that I sit in this chair because I've learned to adopt to a system of white supremacy and maneuver and manipulate it, but I'm just aware, right? Versus, and exactly what Duchesne was saying here, our Black parents, again, it's about the relationship. That the fact they can call that principal and that principal cares about their child, it's that.
It's not the driver, right?
It's not the driver.
Will this, when they look in their teacher's eyes, will they feel loved and valued and seen and supported, believed in, right? And too often, and it bears out based on the difference that our kids often have in too many school settings, right? That's not what's there for any number of reasons. That they don't find that sense of belief coming back at them.
So all of the other indicators that we normally look at as a region are highly important, right? So don't get me wrong, right? Income, household income, educational attainment and levels, those things are highly important. But if we don't figure out how to tap into what families value, right? It's human-centered design 101, right? Empathy, right? What do people value? And then you build a product or service around it. And ultimately the return is, you'll get these other returns that you weren't necessarily looking for. And so as we try to rebuild this thing, as we try to get more equity and parity, making sure that we center what families value and start there. And I think we'll be able to build a more equitable system.
We've seen that a lot in the entrepreneurial space. So if you look at accelerators at large, companies that go through an accelerator are 23% more likely to survive 5 years out. But when we look at who actually participates, it's not people of color, it's not women. And the result is that the financing gap for women and people of color starting high growth startups is getting wider and wider. On the other side of things, when we launched Lunar, we knew the ecosystem wasn't working for the majority of the entrepreneurs and innovators in our community. And so we asked them, using human-centered design, what do you value? What would make a program work for you? And they did say community. So they made our mandate to create an unshakable system of support for them that's really rooted in their peers, that's building community across entrepreneurs, that's creating opportunities for them to learn from each other, not just kind of what I think is traditionally looked at as like vertical social networks, but more of this like horizontal valuing. And I think that your point about what do we value is really at the root of that tension for capitalism versus long-term equity. And how do we start to push and challenge people to expand that time horizon on what our return is going to look like? Because when people are healthier, when they are healing, when we are working on generational trauma, they can show up as their best selves. They can be their best employees. We can challenge our own notions of, I think, productivity, which is absolutely rooted, right, in white supremacy and capitalism. And I think that we can all start to move in that direction that is shifting those value systems to not just be, how do I hold and maintain my wealth? You know, how do we hold and maintain each other? I think is what we're really trying to push in the ecosystem. And before George Floyd was murdered, Lunar was the first accelerator dedicated and really built by entrepreneurs who identify as BIPOC women and LGBTQ. And now we're seeing more and more people coming out of the woodwork and saying, like, we need to be doing this better. We need to be challenging the current systems that have previously built up startups. Why can't we value a $20 million potential company at the same way that we do a unicorn if it's creating a ripple effect of value in our community, if it's creating jobs, if it's, you know, that there's so many other ways I think that we can be looking at those value systems. And conversations like these and, like, you know, the work that you all are doing, I think are so critical in really pushing people to rethink that.
Danielle, something you said really struck me in a couple of ways. One is thinking about a longer time horizon for a return. I think that's super important. One of the questions I saw in advance was, you know, to be thinking about why we haven't seen more progress along certain indicators, given how long we've been talking about or thinking about talking about equity. And I think as a region, we lack a certain level of temperance and diligence and focus, so that we're able to extend that time horizon. But I also think it's important that we reframe, or that there's an opportunity to reframe return. We are oriented collectively toward action, but not learning. You know, so what if we identify learnings and lessons learned as a return? Like, what would that look like? If we could be constantly working in a loop of continuous improvement, what would that look like? It would require vulnerability, which is why we don't do it, in my opinion. So, like, I'm now opining. I've been working all week on not editorializing, and so that would all come out.
Let it out, girl.
Yeah. But I think at the heart of what plagues us is an unwillingness to be vulnerable. We've got to admit that we tried something and it didn't work, or we know a thing and we're nervous about sharing that we know a thing because somebody else might, you know, poke holes in it, and, like, share that. I would want to know that. We need to learn and have to acknowledge that part of learning is failing. We understand it in business, but for whatever reason, business doesn't necessarily understand that in terms of really driving progress toward equitable outcomes for the people in this region. And I that has to change.
Oftentimes in this work, people say the past is the past, let's move forward. How can we do self-reflection and look inner to go forward, which we're all agreeing is a part of this work, without looking at the past? How do those things come into conversation from y'all's perspective?
Well, I think they can. I think one of the things, you know, Adair, you talked about listening, and I know a lot of companies, and Medica is no exception, after the murder of George Floyd, had listening sessions. We had small groups that we facilitated with executives and folks from our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee. And it was people being vulnerable and being uncomfortable in those conversations of sharing their experiences. Because you had folks that are in those groups going, I had no idea. I had no idea what it looked like from you and how the lens you had, because I only know what I know. So that's kind of like bringing in the past in terms of their life experiences to put it on the table to build the team a better community. So we're starting internally with our community and then taking it abroad. But I think that's one way of getting a little bit of the past is to ask about your experiences. Adair, you and I were on a group to understand, you know, DEI a little bit and talking about each of us and our experiences. And I have a lot more understanding and respect. And actually what that session did for me was made me think about myself and a call to action. But, you know, you bring experiences, I bring experiences. Let's get those on the table and figure out then how to move forward.
I think there's also an opportunity to be really critical and self-critical, especially for those of us that identify as white, on when are we choosing to listen? When are people speaking and we are not hearing? And I think that that's what we saw last year with George Floyd is every company did listening sessions. And a lot of the employees were like, I've been talking, right? And that's no, you know, shade on the leadership. I think it's about how do we build in better mechanisms for listening? How do we build in opportunities to take control over their own listening? You know, I I follow on social media people that are unlike me because I want to hear what they are saying. When they have a complaint or they have a criticism and I question it, I need to look at the history. I need to figure out where that's coming from. And I think that's my job in terms of the listening and the moving forward. And I think all of us have a role in that. I think that that's something that felt really loud last year was the number of listening sessions that happened. In order to get to pledges, in order to get to plans of action. And I think we're kind of still waiting on how those value systems are changing and how are we really integrating listening in a way that can create not just reactionary change, but responsive and long-term change in a different way. Because I think that I was also part of a lot of conversations where particularly white women, I think, would have asked the women of color in the room to be the ones to educate them when really it needed to be on us. It needed to be the white women looking at and doing the research on the history, because all that does when you ask people who have been oppressed and who have been experiencing this trauma is you trigger that again in a lot of ways. And I think that that's a really important opportunity that we have as a community to move forward in a different way so that we don't recreate what happened last year on many, many levels.
Can I just poke,
No, go ahead. No.
When you're talking about history, Abdul, like I immediately went to like history.
Yeah. That's where I was trying to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, the listening sessions are important. They're valuable. There is important information there, and guidance to be gleaned for the current state of affairs. If it doesn't also include like our like national history and like our origin story and really wrestles with that, so much of our country was built on capitalism, which was able to advance because like on the backs of other people because they were dehumanized. So land seizure, genocide, chattel slavery, like though the effects of those things show up very predictably today. Like we've got to wrestle with that like all along the way, and it is tough.
Yep. And then placing the self in that, right? So and that's what I was trying to tease out when someone says, the president of X university, and I go, what's his name? Right? Like I have succumbed to the history and need to deeply internalize how that shows up in my world, in my biases, and what I look at it in leadership, right? And I'm a cat who does equity work, and I still, you know what I mean? And so that's where I'm trying to tease out, the connection between those two.
We have unlearning to do, and we also have to be able to, and I mean it broadly, right? We all have our versions of it, but to acknowledge the history and have some familiarity around what it's meant for all of us, right? In terms of advantage in some areas, maybe some disadvantages in other areas, but to pretend that we could just, move on without looking back and without understanding how we got to now isn't healthy and isn't going to be effective. I mean, so much of the tension we're seeing play out right now in our society is because we have very different views of what happened in November, much less what happened, right? Much less what happened in 1865 or 1887. Right?
1619.
1619, right? And so if we had more of a shared sense, an accurate shared sense of how we got to now, without it requiring, all the white people to give their houses away, right? Which I think is what sometimes people think we're asking for. It's like, I got to give up all my stuff, what? Right? But just to even be able to talk, to acknowledge, the land that was taken, to acknowledge the lives that were taken and the sweat that was invested in other people's wealth. It's even to acknowledge that, and then to be able to talk about things like reparations, like why was that a good reason then to maybe make big investments in historically black colleges, universities? Why is that then a justification for doing other things that actually bring about real long-term equitable change, right? Societal change, instead of arguing about, why someone's moving in line ahead of me. Right, which is where it devolves to so quickly. And so I think if we had that shared sense of history, which is hard, right? It seems harder today than it did 6 months ago, but still essential. We'd be able to have honest conversations about the kinds of investments and choices we should be making today to have a healthier world tomorrow. And if we don't do it, we're going to be in deeper trouble than we are today. We don't get to just kind of stay where we are. Life never works that way, right? We're either going to fix parts of this or we're going to slide further off the shelf.
If any one of us were going to fix a vice that we had or a family issue, there's not a person of education out here that doesn't start at historical kind of context, right?
Come on, Adair.
The acknowledgement of something to be able to heal you today. And we oftentimes forget that when we think about our own institutions. I saw, the race for everybody, again, to put their scorecards out, to put their plans out without the recognition of how did their company come to be? How did the individuals in their company transcend into leadership? How have they marginalized, disenfranchised Black people along the way? And no one did that kind of story, right? It was like, here's where we're going to go 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, don't bring
right?
up old stuff.
No,
don't bring up that old stuff.
Right? But exactly to what we're saying here is that I bet if companies would do that level of analysis and put a figure behind it, now we're talking, that should be your giving.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That's your giving of how much opportunity has been denied to Black and brown people as part of this work.
Why do you think that doesn't happen?
I think people tend to not want to dig up, that level of trauma, right? That emotion. I don't think we're prepared for it. I think, to the same point that was made earlier, that we're not all working from the same playbook, right? There's disinformation, there's denial about that. And so it's easier to say, okay, this is what we're going to do moving forward, which we ultimately know those things will fail if it is not rooted in where did you come from? Like, what brought us to this moment? If there's not some true self-examination around that and institutional examination around that, I don't believe that the efforts moving forward will be true.
I also don't think, again, so much of my world is in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. The people that get to talk about how their failures brought them to today, they're already winners. They're not the people that are on their path and that are learning along the way. And so when we look at just statistically who those quote unquote winners are, you're going to have like a certain type of, I think, culture that comes out of that. When you're walking into a room and you're facing a double standard already just because of what one or two or many identities you're walking in with, that ability to be vulnerable becomes harder and harder. And then on the other side of power, for those of us that did come in with privilege, I could sit here and tell many stories that none of you want to listen to about when I have acted, as a racist, right? But like saying that is so traumatic and hard, and to be the owner and to be culpable is something that is not easy and that is not rewarded. It's not embraced in the same way. And I think to your point around the increase in uncomfortable conversations, like we're getting closer to that. I think we're getting closer to a place where a white, heterosexual, cisgendered, highly educated woman like myself can walk into a room and, for the first time, I'm getting to say really explicit, uncomfortable things about activities that I have done or that I see in our space, and I'm not getting shuttered in the same way. As a nonprofit organization, we want to talk about the role of philanthropy in equity and why we are not different than where we are, given that billions and billions of dollars have been invested in this in our community over the past 25 years. I think one of the things that philanthropy can be doing is by working on that time horizon, by creating that space for vulnerability. We need more organizations like Black Women's Wealth Alliance and Center for Economic Inclusion and Lunar startups to get multi-year grants. We need that space for learning. We need that space to be able to evolve with each other.
Your runway matters.
Yeah.
So I want to just quick round robin. I want to know, what's one thing we need to stop doing in order to advance racial equity? It's the first thing that comes to y'all mind.
One thing?
Just one thing. Yep, just one thing. First thing that comes to your mind.
Rushing to action.
Rushing to action. Excellent.
Stop making pledges and statements with no capital to back it up.
We can stop trying to fix it on our own, because I think that the real solutions are going to be about co-creation, especially when you're centering Black and other people of color in those discussions and in the power that's exchanged in that work?
The one thing I think we need to stop doing is standing up a diversity, equity, and inclusion department within our companies and then hiring the person of color to lead it. And that's the only representation of people of color on our executive teams.
If they're on the executive team.
Yes, because a lot of times they report to the HR executive.
Yes. Yes. Can we talk about that? Okay, I'm sorry, John didn't go, but like, can we talk about that? Oh, I'm glad somebody else named that.
Well, I think that's one of the other things that we see is like this segregation, which I think is intentional, of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our companies, in our organizations. If it only lives in HR, our friends at Team Dynamics last year told us that the average budget for a diversity, equity, and inclusion organization in the nonprofit sector is $10,000.
Yeah.
And I don't know the data in the private sector, but I have talked to a lot of chief diversity officers or directors, and they're on shoestrings. And they're completely isolated from the rest of the company, from the buyer team, from the producer teams, like whatever the industry is, they're completely separate from all of those other individuals. So the segregation of that, I think, demonstrates to what extent a company really values it, to what extent a company really wants to make change.
John, what's
I'm just serious for a lot of folks that I know, stop pretending that there isn't an issue. I just think you got to start with awareness again. I think too many people have their head in the sand and not acknowledging that we really have a crisis.
Still?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
I think, that's my job is to make our team aware of what's happening and my sphere of influence, but watch what's happening in elections. You see what's happening around the country.
Yeah, that's
I
good.
mean, it's like, there's a denial or a lack that the history ever happened or that the impact that it has on people today. But the listening piece, listening to you and others and being very active after pandemic and then the George Floyd murder, was listening for long-term solutions. And we challenged our team. We have a crisis here in our community. What can we do? And we were out in Minnetonka, and it's difficult for people in the city to come out and work there, yet alone come out for an interview or something. And we said, we got to create jobs in the community. So as many of you know, we opened an office in Midway District in St. Paul, right down the street here. And we've hired 40 people in high-paying jobs with benefits from the community to start to build relationships with all the organizations in the community, and we're listening. So to your point, what people want and need here is going to be different than in Minnetonka where our corporate headquarters is. We got to listen here and build something here that's meaningful to the community, create economic development jobs. But anyway, I think we got to stop denying that we have a crisis.
And stop assuming that there's one silver bullet, that a training is going to fix it, right? It's the actualization of that this is a process and it's going to take all of us in different capacities kind of working on that.
We got here over generations of injustice, and we're not going to change this tomorrow, but there's things we can do now to make a difference tomorrow. And again, I think it's having that horizon of what's the journey we're on? What are we doing to make a difference?
So let me wrap this up by coming back to the budget example that you gave. If you were to look at my finances, you know that I love to travel. I love to go out to eat, have some drink. I love my family. Those are the three things you're going to know that I care about and that I love. So let's look at the organizations. If $10,000 is what's going to your equity and inclusion department or area, we'll know whether or not you care. So with that, I really appreciate y'all being with us. Acooa, Adair, John, Duchesne, and Danielle, thank y'all for being with us. Great conversation. Y'all are teaching me, keep being dope, and keep moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.